welcome to Eye on Gainesville. I'm Katil Feltz. 75 years ago on April 6, 1936, at approximately 8:27 in the morning, two tornadoes converged in the central business district of this perfect southern town. More than 200 people died. Almost 1,000 businesses and homes were damaged or destroyed. The tornado remains to this day the fifth deadliest in our nation's history. Gainesville resident W.M. Bryce tells the story best in his book, A City Laid Waste. Throughout this show, I'll reference information from Bryce's book. I'll take you on a tour of the tornado exhibit at the Northeast Georgia History Center, and the voices of actors will take us back to that fateful day and the days that followed. Joining me now to talk about the destruction and the rebuilding of Gainesville is retired history professor Dr. Steve Gurr. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Very glad to have you here because I know you are just full of information about so much about Gainesville and then today specifically about the tornado.
Well, I've been here only 25 years, but in 25 years you soak up a lot of history. Gainesville, if you think about the square as being the focal point of Gainesville's history in the modern times, it has been since the beginning, and so in 1936 this community was very much what it had been from its pioneer days: commercial center, transportation center. It's just the nature of the transportation and the commerce that was changing. We had the mills supporting a large part of the economy. Several mills had been established since about the 1880s, and Chicopee most recently in 1926. We had great mill community. We had a little cotton being grown out in the farmland now because of those mills, but we were still a rural, agriculturally based community, but because of its central location and availability of the rail transportation, Gainesville was a trade place, external trade, and bringing in commerce from north of here in the region. As far as the square's commerce, it was pretty typical with grocery stores and clothing stores and barbershops. We had movies. This is the 1930s is very much like the modern times. If you would think of the Gainesville today in the 2000s as being shrunk from the extremities into the interior, all those things that are out on the Browns Bridge Road now would have been around the square within easy walking distance of the square. So it was a more lively center than we think of because people came there for economic activity.
It's Monday morning, business as usual, people packed out around the square. Out of nowhere comes this storm.
About 8:20 that morning, I was standing in the bathroom shaving when I heard what seemed to be an airplane. This sound increased until I decided it was a fleet of planes, but I could not understand why they were flying over Gainesville so early in the morning. I stepped over to my bathroom window, and the sight I saw was one that will never be forgotten. Coming toward Gainesville from the southwest, rather high in the air, was a tornado, and in the vortex could be seen large timbers, parts of trees, and other debris. About 30 minutes later, while I was eating breakfast, one of my associates came to tell me that the tornado had struck Gainesville. I went to town immediately, where I was met by the mayor and the chairman of the local Red Cross, who jointly requested me to take charge of the situation. I went back to Riverside and moved into Gainesville. Some 400 of our older cadets and about 40 faculty officers who for 8 continuous hours did as fine a piece of work as can be imagined. Colonel Sandy Beaver, president of Riverside Military Academy.
We heard those comments from Colonel Beaver, who I understand later became a general, but you have your own stories about what you heard about the destruction. Tell us about that.
Well, there's still a number of people who were around during that time, and one of my friends was getting a haircut just on the edge of the square, and he said people were headed to school, kids were headed to the nearby Gainesville High School, people coming to work, people were at work already in the factories and commercial areas, stores were about to open, so it was, as they say, just a dark and stormy morning, and everybody was watching the weather at that time.
Let's talk more about the destruction.
We always tend to measure things in dollars and cents rather than any other measure. And we say $13 million damage. It's hard to translate that into modern terms, but 700 to 1,000 structures were damaged. Maybe as many as 1,000 people were injured. And of course, we cite the figure of just over 200 killed. Most of those in an area at a pants factory, the Cooper Pants Factory, which was near the square.
Talk to me about the pants factory.
Okay.
And what I understand that, as we said, it was early in the morning, just after 8:30. Everyone had just gone to work, just gotten inside. Everyone was working.
Well,
what happens?
Recently it's been discovered that there was some concern about when the damage was done in that building with a fire, because that's what killed about 70 women that were there. They were alarmed about the nature of the weather. It was very dark. It had been raining and it was dark, and while there weren't any tornado warnings per se, they were headed down to the basement. And we now understand that there was a fire that began before the tornado actually occurred. Someone knocked over a heater and the fire started there. So when they went to the basement, a fire had started. They were in the basement, and when the tornado hit, it trapped them in that fire in the basement.
Where was the Cooper Pants factory located?
Over near where the Gainesville Midland is now, near the Gainesville Midland location.
So kind of back over behind Luna's and the Arts Depot, right in that area.
That's right. That's right.
I got down on the stairway. A woman was blown against me and knocked me down. My head was hanging within an iron rail frame. I held onto this iron rail with my left hand for almost an hour, while parts of my body were buried in the brick and timbers. "It's catching fire," I screamed. "Won't someone come and help out?" I thought I would choke with the smoke and dust in my face. I heard women screaming, crying, confessing, praying, pleading as the flames reached up and licked them down. I hollered and begged for them to get me out, and they finally came. Even 4 weeks after the storm, I am still very sore. Miss Anna Sexton, the last woman to be taken out alive from the Cooper Pants factory.
The History Channel featured the tornado of 1936 in a special segment in 1998 with survivors Charlie Frierson and George Austin.
That morning, merchants went about their business and workers clocked in at the factories. 10-year-old Charlie Frierson was sent to school early by his mother so he would not get wet in the storm that was threatening.
The weather was just extremely warm and very quiet, very still. The clouds were very black, and there was a yellow lining at the horizon covering the whole town. Just a very eerie feeling.
That feeling did not deter 14-year-old George Austin as he walked toward school with a neighbor.
A friend came by in an old A-model Ford car with a rumble seat, and he had a passenger in the front seat with him. And he stopped and asked us if we wanted to ride in the rumble seat to school, which was only a couple of blocks away. And we said, "No thanks, we'll just walk on."
At 8:38 a.m., George Austin and his friend saw the oak trees begin to sway and dip in the wind. Then, the trunks completely uprooted. Not one, but 2 tornadoes were converging at the edge of downtown.
We turned and ran back the way we had come. So we went into the Imperial drugstore as the storm was on us, and really we were hitting the deck at this time. And I was attracted by the steam radiator that was in the center of the aisle. And I thought that would be a good protection against any flying debris or falling materials.
Young Charlie Frierson and his mother fought their way downtown to find Charlie's father. The family store was an unrecognizable heap. The funnel cloud had raked right across the town square.
The expression on people's faces, people could not believe the destruction. You were there and you couldn't believe it was hard to comprehend the total destruction, the wiping out of a really fine town.
We flew blind most of the way, and when we did come out of the overcast, we sighted columns of smoke rising a little to the right of the nose of the ship. We swung over in that direction and were soon over at Gainesville, or what was left of it would be nearer the mark. I could hardly believe my eyes. It was literally blown apart. The destruction was terrible and still going on. As we circled only a few hundred feet over the center of the city, the walls of buildings were crashing into the streets and there were fires springing up all over the place. My co-pilot asked me what the people were doing, and I said, "Did you ever kick an ant hill apart and watch the ants scramble madly about, not knowing which way to turn or what to do? Well, that's the way the people in the city looked to us, so stunned and shocked that they just ran with no purpose. The suffering must have been terrible. Pilot Lee Willie.
We live in an era when communication occurs simultaneously with an event, so we can't, I don't think, begin to understand what it's like to wait 2 days for a newspaper to report on the tornado. Let's talk about the communication that was available back then.
Well, we had been a radio nation since the mid-1920s, so radio communications was obviously available, and we were pretty soon have radio stations in Gainesville. But at this time, of course, one of the big problems was a lot of the electrical power disrupted by the tornado. Ordinarily, telephones, telegraph, people coming and going on the trains and on buses. There were bus services. So people learned firsthand, usually by personal communication. One of the best stories to me is that Carl Lawson was in Los Angeles, California, as a young man studying, and the day of the tornado in California, he saw a newspaper headline, midday there, that described the tornado in his hometown. Of course, the time difference and the telegraph communications led to that's pretty quick reporting for across the country.
I noticed in the book, A City Laid Waste, there's a lot of time and attention is given to what everybody was reporting and what WSB in Atlanta was doing and WGST and the Atlanta paper at the time. So it was very important for them to be able to get any kind of information. They were hungry for it in a way that we probably are overloaded today.
That's right. That's right. Well, people came, the reporters came obviously, but there were stringers, and every community had stringers for these papers, and they were in communication with the papers right away.
And it sounds like from some of the excerpts that I've read that they were lucky enough to find those people that you always see after a tornado describing the experience. It was the same thing way back then.
They seem to show up, they do.
And I've heard it called all different kinds of things. The book, and I'm sure you also too, full of so many stories of just unbelievable occurrences and just some really great stories. I want you to share one of those with us later in the show. But I want to talk about who the city turned to for help.
Well, we today are so attuned to there being a national or a state or an agency. In the case of Gainesville, we're very fortunate to have local agencies and local institutions, our churches. This was a town of churches. They were one of the first places we turned for some very practical help. These churches served as morgues and as temporary aid stations. The Riverside Military Academy cadets came and helped. The Georgia Guard came. Organizations like the American Legion VFWs would send help. And Red Cross was a very big part of this aid immediately, as it always has been in the national disasters.
The Red Cross is maintained through the kindness and generosity of the American people. From the Porterdale Mill community near Covington came $917. Some high school graduates denied themselves the joy of the senior banquet and sent $35. Sunday school classes gave their pennies. A farm boy had 45 cents. It was all he possessed. He gave 25 cents. The Gainesville Mill people gave out of their weekly income $1,060. Although the Chicopee people were out of work some weeks last fall, they gave $1,000. The Red Cross must be far more careful as trustees with this money given in utmost confidence than one would be with individual spending. The Red Cross is a trust fund. Ann Miller.
I live in the Mount Zion community. We heard about the tornado at my school and wanted to help. We washed windows and dishes for pennies. We are sending $11.08 to help the people of Gainesville. Student from Mount Zion.
How long did it take for the cleanup to begin?
Oh, it was almost immediately, in part because it was a rescue as well as a cleanup. And the rescue required clearing away debris. I think one of the things that's a parallel people can understand is if you see war towns of Europe right after World War II, when the people are dressed up and out in the streets removing the brick, those would be what the scenes looked like in Gainesville the day of the tornado itself. It began immediately, and it's impressive if you read the newspapers a week or so later, how many buildings had windows replaced and had signs that they were back in business. It was very important. This was a critical core of the economy. That square had to be cleaned away to keep up the business. So it went on, but amazingly, there's very little said about this. Within the first year, people have more or less passed by the tornado, and the cleanup has been done, and the rebuilding is well underway. We had help from the federal government and the state government, but this was something that we had received earlier. We had had aid for other projects. The post office had been built prior to this, and so we were accustomed to getting aid from outside for public facilities.
I did read where for about 2 days you couldn't find anything, couldn't buy anything, paralyzed for maybe 2 days.
Yeah.
And then just a couple weeks after that, the scaffolding is already up downtown, and people are rebuilding,
That's
and everybody's pitching in.
Yes, that's right. Well, the agencies were able to get in, like as we said about Red Cross, were able to get in almost immediately, and they provided temporary medical aid and food and supplies like that in many areas of the community. Not all Gainesville was destroyed by any means, but there was enough that we needed some immediate help from outside, but ultimately we had to clean up because it was in our best interest to continue. We didn't wait for a suit to be settled. We didn't wait for a bill to be signed, but we had to begin the work right away.
Talk to us about what they felt like they needed back then.
Well, this was a redevelopment opportunity of a lifetime in a way, but the city hall, courthouse was destroyed. Schools were in need of repair and building. We needed new schools. Public facilities that were in the interest of the community. They were, we might say, quite unselfish because they were public needs, and they tended to serve everybody. So those kind of things were needed.
I noticed also there were a lot of street and road improvements that they wanted.
Yes, yes. We've entered the automobile era about 50 years before, and we're still a dirt road, dirt street community. Paved roads, there were, I think, one paved road leading into Gainesville from outside. There were 8 major roads out of Gainesville. So anything that could bring us up to speed, this was an opportunity to begin, much like Europe did after the war. They had a head start on the future. This gave Gainesville a bit of a head start on the future.
Favorite tornado story?
I still have people describe mysteries to me. One friend says his car was parked on the square. His windows were rolled up, but when he got back in his car, there was a big rip in the headliner, and the windows were closed, and the doors were closed, and he's to this day trying to figure out what happened to the interior of his automobile. So it's like those straws going through the telephone pole stories that you hear about tornadoes. Everybody's got a special one. One friend came out of the wreckage of the tornado and saw no one on the square. He thought he was the last person on earth. It's just total devastation. It's great to talk to someone who was there, and they never forget the details.
Well, Dr. Gurr, thank you so much for sharing with us on this 75th anniversary. And you'll just have to come back and join us again on TV 18 and share some of your other historical knowledge.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you. If you want to know more about the tornado of 1936, visit the Northeast Georgia History Center. I stopped by to talk with Director Glenn Kyle.
April 6, 1936 was one of the worst days in Northeast Georgia history. The tornado came through downtown Gainesville, and this is a photograph of the city before the tornado came through. Here you see the square, the monument of Old Joe that everyone knows, the federal building here. This sort of shows the layout of the city before the tornado. A bustling, vibrant urban area in Northeast Georgia, really the center of commerce, transportation, communication for the entire Northeast Georgia region.
Even back in 1936.
Even back in 1936.
And what is interesting to me too is that, here's a house right on the corner. This is where the current Hall County Courthouse is located. So here, these homes go right up to what we currently know as the square.
Now this map sort of shows what's happened. This weather system had been moving in from the western part of the United States and had actually gone through Tupelo, Mississippi, caused a terrible tornado there with a lot of lives lost. By the time it got to this region, the storm had again picked up speed. The Gainesville tornado of 1936 actually started out as 2 different tornadoes, and they converged right before they got to the square, creating a huge swirling vortex, and went through downtown Gainesville before they split up again and spawned a 3rd tornado on Brenau campus that went through New Holland. This case we have here shows some of the things that reported the effects of the tornado, as well as some of the rebuilding efforts. Of course, the newspapers, the Gainesville News is printing issues again on April 8th, only 2 days after. Again, that speaks to the importance of the newspaper and the role of that society. That's how they got their news, especially with electricity, water, all of those things taken away from them because of the tornado and the resulting fires caused a great amount of chaos. There were over 200 people killed in this tornado. It's still the 5th deadliest in the United States. One official count has been listed as 203, but one of the interesting things is they did not keep exact records in those days of African American deaths from the tornado. It was the same thing with the one that hit in Tupelo, Mississippi. Those records just weren't accurately kept, so the figure is higher than 203. One of the things that the main history of this tornado that you can get in print is a book called City Laid Waste. We have one of the original copies here, and this is the typewriter that he did the original manuscript on. So we've not only chronicled the story of the tornado, we've chronicled the story of the tornado here.
I see also the headlines from the Atlanta Journal, near 1,000 hurt, property loss $15 million.
This made statewide and nationwide news. One of the more remarkable things was that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president at the time, was actually on a trip coming back north on his train. He always traveled by trains. That was his preferred method. And the day after, the evening after the tornado, he stops in Gainesville and surveys the damage and promises the people of Gainesville that they will receive help from the federal government to rebuild. This is very interesting. This is Colonel C.C. Sanders. When folks come in here, they get confused. It's not the Colonel Sanders of chicken restaurant fame, but another one, a Georgian, Christopher Columbus Sanders, who served in the American Civil War as a Confederate officer. And behind you, you see the picture of the federal building in Gainesville, and there is originally his statue was placed there. At the time, it was the only statue of a Confederate on federal property that was not a battlefield. When the tornado came through, it picked this entire marble structure up and hurled it hundreds and hundreds of yards, broke the head off, and the pieces were scattered all over. One of them landed on a car. Now, what's interesting about this, obviously this statue was just obliterated into lots of different pieces. And when you look at the two pieces, you notice that the body is much more worn and has seen a lot more aging than the head. The head someone was able to take and put it away. They kept the head, but this sat out in the weather for all those years. When we were putting this exhibit together in the old Green Street Fire Station, everyone knew we were trying to tell the history of the tornado, and someone came forward with the head of Colonel Sanders to complete that exhibit. So it's a really neat story about how these objects survived the tornado and went forward.
I was reading the story here earlier, and I noticed that this statue was actually donated in 1908, so just over 100 years old now.
Yes, absolutely.
The part that I'm so familiar with from the tornado is, of course, the story of President Roosevelt coming to Gainesville, promising, as you said, to rebuild Gainesville bigger and better. And although we give so much credit to him, we still know that the majority of the credit really belongs to the people who were here at the time.
Absolutely. A national leader providing bookends for something that happened here in Gainesville, I think, is really the neat part of that story. Like, as I said previously, he came through the day after the tornado, surveyed the destruction from his train, and promised to help rebuild Gainesville. We did receive federal aid. Projects like WPA came in to help, but it was a community effort. And 2 years later, a new courthouse had been built, and he came for the dedication on March 23rd of Roosevelt Square and gave a speech there that day. Edgar Dunlap was a close friend of his, and he arranged for Roosevelt to come to Gainesville again to serve as a bookend for those events that happened between April 6, 36 and March 23rd, 1938. And we have newspapers here that show this. Again, here's the
City Hall.
The City Hall. Right. The buildings are very familiar, and the podium currently resides at Gainesville High School. They use it for their commencement ceremonies, so that still exists. It was built specifically for this event by Gainesville City employees.
It's a great piece of art. impact. It really is. The eagle that's engraved on the side, and understand that it is going to be part of a temporary exhibit here at the museum.
That's right. To commemorate the 75th anniversary of this tornado, we're going to have a special exhibit here. This room in this display, of course, is a permanent exhibit, but we have new things, new items that we want to show to highlight and commemorate that anniversary. One of the most amazing things that we have in there, I think, we received in the pages of a scrapbook. Someone had kept a scrapbook of news clippings. Tucked into these pages was a Western Union telegram that a lady had sent to her family in New York, and it says, "All here safe, terrible destruction everywhere, J.L. Rudolph." That telegram was sent on April 6th at 2 p.m., only a few hours after that tornado, because the Western Union telegram office at the depot was the only way news was able to get out of Gainesville that this had happened. Telephones were down, everything was down. That telegram was one of those examples of communication. So we're going to have a lot of neat things here. The podium's going to be here, and that exhibit will be all during the month of April from the 1st to the 30th.
Glenn, most of the museum exhibits we see these days are static, but that is not the case when it comes to the tornado exhibit here at the History Center.
No, it's not. Most of what I've taken you through so far is really just the narrative using objects of the tornado. But what we have here is a machine that creates a tornado. It is by far the most popular aspect, not only of this display, but of the entire museum. It creates a vortex using a large fan that draws air upwards and different air vents that blow in effect a circle that create the tornado effect. And it uses water. People can reach in, touch the tornado, it breaks it apart, it comes back. And it's just a really great tool to not only talk about what a tornado is, it gives a sense of what it was like to see one, but it's also a great tool that a history museum can use to teach a little bit of science.
Main Street Gainesville has been working with the History Center and Hall County to make the tornado of 1936 even more visible. Angela Thompson is the Main Street manager.
As part of the 75th anniversary of the 1936 tornado, we have placed a historic marker on a brick pillar on the downtown square on Washington Street between Bradford Street and Main Street. Additionally, Main Street Gainesville and the Northeast Georgia History Center have teamed up to create a self-guided historic walking tour of the 1936 tornado. You will be able to look at the downtown square and see firsthand where the destruction occurred. Go to downtowngainesville.com or stop by the Gainesville Tourism and Trade Office to pick up your copy today.
In closing, I'd like to read an excerpt from a city laid waste that describes Gainesville after it was rebuilt. Gainesville's more than 10,000 people form a happy, prosperous, progressive whole, united in spirit, facing the future with more faith, more fortitude, more determination, since the ravages of the tornado has brought them closer together in unity and in purpose toward a common goal. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on this very special edition of Eye on Gainesville, and I'd like to dedicate this show to the victims and the survivors of the tornado of 1936. If there's a particular issue you'd like to see us discuss here at TV18, you can email pr@gainesville.org or call 770-297-5499. For TV18, I'm Katil Feltz.